All right, here we are. Here I am, joined by the incredible, the Reverend Dr. Kappes and the incredible Dr. Reynolds. We're here to talk about the life of Muhammad in early ancient sources, and I'm just really thrilled to be here with you two. Just really an incredibly fun topic I think we're going to talk about today. These two individuals need no introduction. Father Kappes, incredible work that he does. He's a dean for a Byzantine Catholic seminar. Does an amazing work in various different fields. And of course, Dr. Gabriel Reynolds, in my opinion, one of the top in the field, in this particular field of Quranic studies, Islamic studies, just magnificent, written many books. And for people that are wondering, the link to each of their works, so you're going to be able, once you watch this live, it'll be down there. You can click, check it out. There'll also be a link over there to Dr. Reynolds' channel. He's got a new channel that he's been running. People have to head over there. You've got to subscribe because he has incredible material there. But I'm thrilled to be here with you all. And I'll begin with you, Father. How are you today?
I'm doing very well, and thanks for having me.
Thrilled to have you. Dr. Reynolds, how are you? Great to be back with you.
Doing well. Thank you. Happy to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, and let me kind of, just to start off the conversation, let me ask you all, and whoever would like to take the first question. When it comes to the life of Muhammad in ancient sources, I don't really see this topic really come up a whole lot. And usually when dialoguing with people, they really don't know where to begin on this issue. What are your thoughts on that?
I'd like to defer to Dr. Reynolds, who's going to have an expansive response, and then I can add in the tiny little niche that I've played around in, and hopefully maybe add something to the conversation.
Well, that's very gracious of you, and now the pressure's on to say something intelligent about the topic. Well, I mean, I think it's a really good question, William, because in fact, when it comes to introducing Islam, most people stick to the standard biography, and I do too. So when I'm teaching at Notre Dame, teaching my, at least in the undergraduate classes that I teach, for example, this semester at Notre Dame, I'm teaching a course entitled Islam and Christian Theology. And sort of the foundation of that class is to introduce the Qur'an, the life of the Prophet. And when we do the life of the Prophet, I sort of say things like, listen, critical scholars have some questions, they debate some things, but, we're just going to start. We're going to use the chronology, traditional dates, 570 for the birth, 610 for the first proclamation, 622 for the migration from Mecca to Medina, 632 for the Prophet's death. And I think that's reflected also in most introductory works on Islam, especially on the Prophet's life that you find. So it's a difficult topic, right? Because it's extremely important to have a good understanding of Muslim beliefs in regard to the life of the Prophet. That's a starting point for dialogue. And so, that's really, it's a question of respect, but also a question of understanding the coherence of the theological vision of Muslims. But meanwhile, there are all these interesting questions that critical scholars debate, which we'll be speaking about today. So sorting through that sort of almost dual vision, so the traditional view and the critical view, and being able to speak intelligently about both while being respectful to Muslims is a challenge.
William, before I started, you may not know this, Dr. Reynolds, but at least I think William's beginning conversations with you had to do with William and I getting acquainted because he kept calling me and pestering me with all sorts of questions. And when I actually decided that he was a hard worker and would actually go and do some of the work, and the questions weren't, hey, would you do a bunch of free work for me? But they were actually asking for real sources to read. We started to become friends because he was doing hard work and coming back with some kind of interesting finds. But when he got into Islam, I'm very bad at self-promotion, and I've been challenged at our school that we have to start talking more about our books. So I want to talk about some of your books that actually led me to start doing some of this research. So I have here on my little Audible, which I listen to in the car. I mean, the ones that I introduced William to, and I told him that these were really the basis of me just kind of starting out, trying to refresh my ideas of Islam, were that you've written an introduction to Islam, the Bible, and the Quran, and a book, Christian and Islamic Theology. And I have listened to all those, and those really did form a foundation for me to kind of start to explore, after having neglected for a very long time any interest in Islam. So I'm very appreciative of being able to sit down with you today, because I've had these and listened to them several times, just because the message is very straightforward. There's not a lot of complicated vocabulary for without explanation for the listeners of William's channel. So I just wanted to kind of plug your book so that you didn't have to do maybe something that I find uncomfortable, which is to plug myself during shows. But that being said, my own approach, I think, is a little bit different. And Dr. Reynolds was kind enough during the COVID period to take a look at a little peek into some of the things that I was doing with looking at John Damascene, who may not be the first to talk about Islam from a Christian point of view. We have Anastasius the Sinite, and we even have some other lesser known probably figures to people that are listening here. Even Sophronius of Jerusalem has a few mentions, which have become well known because they're even available in English now in a collected book, which I won't get distracted with for the moment. But the major thing that I'm interested in, I think where there's an intersect with Dr. Reynolds and I, are that I've noticed, at least from my reading, is that so many people have not taken an interest in John Damascene's information on early Islam, particularly about the biography of Muhammad. And I put out a little while ago, just for people's consumption, and sent before the show, just in case we needed to reference it, some of the key passages with John Damascene. And I'm kind of tackling what Dr. Reynolds was talking about, which is namely the non-Muslim sources, but treating with respect Muhammad. Now, some of those sources don't speak very respectfully of Muhammad, because of course they're opponents. But John Damascene is, I think, very valuable, because what I'd like to suggest is that by him being in conversation with actual boots on the ground Muslims who are in presumably the holy city, from the best that we can guess where some of this material is coming from, potentially, less likely, Damascus, that John actually has access to kind of the earliest traditions about Muhammad's life. And these tend to be passed over, and I'm not sure why, even though there's a lot of discussion. For example, in Ibn Ishaq, there's plenty of articles and references to this so-called figure of Bahira, who is allegedly some sort of Syriac-speaking monk, who is, if not Muhammad's educator, certainly his acquaintance. And the Arabic sources, of course, are going to want to avoid the fact that Muhammad would be educated by a human teacher, whereas the Syriac sources quite happily want to emphasize that kind of relationship. But John the Damascene is actually an earlier witness to this. And I think one of the things that I'd kind of like to throw out for Dr. Gabriel Reynolds is the idea that John Damascene actually draws attention to the fact, and this is something I haven't seen addressed, that the reason why Christians in the Holy City, if in fact he's reflecting dialogues that are happening, as I propose, in the mid to late 600s at the Kathisma shrine in Jerusalem, and the reason why this is a new find, I think, and I do need to put something out there in literature, is because John Damascene, in his discussion, in his dialogue between a Muslim and a Christian, he associates not only biblical passages of discussion which coincide with work that's already been done on the lectionary cycle at the Kathisma, but he also associates some of the debates with the doctrine of the Assumption of Mary, which is happening at the Kathisma shrine, which nobody has drawn attention to. And to have a dialogue where you're defending issues that have to do with the Assumption of Mary, while at the same time debating the status of Mary and the divine status of Christ, it narrows things down to pretty much the only shrine where that could be taking place. And for our listeners, I identify the Qur'an chapter 3 as there's an exhortation there that when Christians are coming together, and I think probably Gabriel's if he hasn't already memorized the Qur'an in order to be a good interlocutor with Muslims, I'm sure he can at least give us a better approximation than I'll be able to do right now. But I think it's around 360, 363, where the presumptive speaker Muhammad is exhorting the people that when they're arguing over the status of Jesus, is when they're coming together for worship, is that they need to pray and figure it out. And my suggestion is that John Damascene, when he is actually referring to such discussions at the Kathisma shrine, he's referring to this idea. But now that I've kind of given some talking points for the Kathisma shrine, the major point that I'm interested in with Dr. Reynolds is, has it been proposed or have you seen that John Damascene, he challenges Muslims that we don't have to believe as Christians, and he's representing his fellow Christians in dialogue with these Muslims. We don't have to believe in Muhammad because he has no life. We don't know where he came from. You're saying he's like Moses. And there's even some references to Deuteronomy and Exodus that are alluded to. Has there been any discussion of a life of Muhammad arising out of the necessity of convincing Christians that Muhammad has just as much a claim to be a new Moses?
Great. I'm happy to pick up there. Yeah, is that okay, William?
Sure.
Should I just, yeah.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Great. Yeah. Wonderful intervention there. And yeah, I'd like to comment on a few points, beginning with the question of Muhammad having an informer. And then I'd like to say a couple of things about the Kathisma Church, and then we can maybe get back to John of Damascus, if that's okay.
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, this is clearly a key element in the early Christian-Muslim dialogue around Muhammad and the source of his proclamations. In some ways, the origins of it are connected to Qur'an, Surah An-Nahl. So that's chapter 16, and I think it's verse 103. And there the Qur'an itself is engaging with the views of opponents who say that Muhammad has a human teacher. And it seems that at issue here is a real person, because the Qur'an says the tongue of the person to whom you're referring is Ajami. The Arabic word is Ajami, which means non-Arabic or foreign, whereas this is an Arabic Qur'an. So lots to be said about language and the nature of Quranic Arabic and all of this. But it seems that there's someone, the person's not named, but there's someone at issue there that the opponents say is the source of the Quranic revelations. And I think in a sense that that is a first stage around this topic of a possible informant. But it's possible that the second stage, where a lot of the texts that you've studied, Father, have stories of this figure named Bahira or Sergius Bahira, which, by the way, as you may know, among Christian communities in the Middle East today is very, very common to hear, the real story. The real story is Bahira, sometimes called Buhaira. He's the real origin for Muhammad's proclamations of the Quran.
Talk about effective propaganda.
Yeah, it's a lasting narrative. So so I mean, that's something that obviously is at issue. A lot of Christians are also interested in the figure of Waraqa the Nawfal, said by Ibn Ishaq to be to have confirmed Muhammad's mission. Other traditions about him say that he used to translate the Injil or the Gospel, and so there's a lot of speculation. Was he a Christian? Was Waraqa somehow the source of Muhammad's revelation? Okay, so that's sort of one topic. And then, the point about the Kathisma church is really important, is extremely interesting for the sake of Quranic studies, but also for, exactly as you're saying, the early Christian Muslim context after the conquest, the Islamic conquest. Now, in terms of the Quran, it's very interesting because we have this problem that the story of the birth of Christ in chapter 19 of the Quran involves a miracle in which the infant Jesus speaks and calls down a blessing upon Mary, which includes the provision of food and drink. This is a story that's known from other sources. It appears in the Gospel of Pseudo Matthew, but it's usually associated with the flight of the Holy Family from Palestine into Egypt. The place where it seems that this miracle was associated instead with the Nativity before Islam is the Kathisma Church. So this is really intriguing, right? Because it suggests that somehow now Surah 19 is understood to be from the Meccan period of Muhammad's life, so proclaimed earlier on between 610 and 622. And yet there's this apparent awareness of a Palestinian tradition. So that's a big problem out there. But then exactly as you say, there's an important lesson also that the Kathisma teaches us, because it has a mihrab. So it has a prayer niche that is a feature of mosques. And it seems that it was the site of joint Muslim-Christian worship. A little bit like the cathedral in Damascus, which until it was turned into a mosque, I believe by Al-Walid Umayyad Caliph, for a period of time was a feature or was a site of joint Christian-Muslim worship. So, yeah, I think that scenario that you suggest, that in a place like Jerusalem, there were Christians and Muslims having conversations over the life of Muhammad, possible informants of Muhammad, and you know this literature very well, because Muslims told their own story about Bahira. In fact, the Muslim story was probably first.
Yeah.
And we could speak about that more. And then, I mean, the final point, I'm probably going on too long here, so hopefully I'm not.
Please.
I hope I'm not
the point on the Kathisma Church was wonderful. Yes. I had not known that.
Yeah, I've stood there with my students. And Notre Dame has a center in Jerusalem, and I took my students up the road to the Kathisma Church, and we stood there, and we actually measured the mihrab using an app on a phone to see how close it is oriented towards Mecca. And it is off, by the way, but that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then, I mean, we could speak more about John of Damascus. I probably have gone on too much and probably distracted the whole conversation.
Oh, that's okay. Did you though want to say something about whether or not the challenge of Damascene in conversation about Deuteronomy, just for our listeners, Deuteronomy 13:1 and Deuteronomy 18:4, that if the earliest life we have by Ibn Ishaq and the earliest references we have in John Damascene both agree that Mohammed is something like a new Moses, because he's overshadowed by a cloud, something that I've drawn attention to in my informal work. Is there any sense in the Hadith or Tafsir that there's a need for this biography, or is Ibn Ishaq all we have?
Great. Yeah. So two points on that. First, in regard to Muhammad and Moses, I would say the most impressive prototype of Muhammad from the Quran's point of view is certainly Moses. Mm-hmm. Jesus sort of stands apart, the Quranic Jesus. We could say more about that. But I mean, there are a number of elements of the traditional understanding of Moses' life, as told in the Pentateuch. As told in Exodus and in the following books, not in Genesis, of course. So most of the Pentateuch that line up with the traditional story of Muhammad's life. Now, a religious Muslim would say, "Oh, of course, because Muhammad fulfills the prophecies."
Sure.
And the prophets, anyway, the Quran says we do not differentiate between them. So this idea that their lives are very similar. But from a more critical point of view, one would say that no, the story of Muhammad's life was told on the model of Moses' life. This includes the idea that God spoke directly to Moses. The Quran uses this term kallama, which implies direct speech. Moses is known in Islamic tradition as Kalim Allah, the one to whom God spoke directly. As he did with Muhammad. The notion of the exodus of the Israelites led by Moses, at least to the gates of the Promised Land, to the Jordan River, out of a city of unbelief or land of unbelief. It's close to the story of the Hijrah and the departure of the faithful followers of Muhammad from Mecca, the unbelieving city, to Medina, which would become the home of Islam. So there's a number of elements there. Even the story of the revelation, the first revelation that Muhammad receives, where he goes up to a mountain and then comes down with divine revelation. He has a vision, according to Ibn Ishaq, on the way down, where he sees the angel Gabriel. All of this lines up in different ways with the story of Mount Sinai that's carried out in the latter parts of Exodus and then in Deuteronomy.
Wow.
So yeah, I would say that that's very, very important for Muslims, this to draw this connection between Moses and Muhammad. One more point about this is that the Quran, when it speaks about the word for divine scripture, kitab, a lot of scholars feel that that's a reference specifically to the Torah and to the Quran. And that from the Quranic point of view, the book given to Jesus, the Injil, is just a reminder of what's in the Torah. And so this is sometimes called the two kitab hypothesis, that basically the kitabs that matter, the books that matter, are that given to Moses and that given to Muhammad.
Great. I was drawn to think, again, in the Damascenian text that we have for our listeners, Damascene is saying, well, when you're dialoguing with, we're going to call them Muslims. There's all kinds of names used in the early times, but we want to be kind of simple here. I just want to make sure we all know we're not being inaccurate. We're just being rather using easy vocabulary. So when John is dialogue, he says, when you're dialoguing with Muslims, if they say X, you need to say Y. And one of the X's that they are saying is that actually the revelations of Muhammad came in dreams. And the reason why this makes sense from John's point of view is, of course, because dreams are an important source of revelation in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So John has to deal with the fact that he's received dreams, and he can't just despise dreams because they're dreams. We might have a tendency to do that today, or to ask Freud to give us a better interpretation of what's going on. But do you have any knowledge, or have you come across anything in the early life or the tafsir, again, a hadith, where there's an admission that Muhammad had dreams, or is the narrative pretty straightforward now? It was direct speech by God and only that, and there's no alternatives.
Great. Well, the Quran itself has an interesting perspective on the nature of Muhammad's revelation. So there's a verse in the Quran which says that God does not reveal except in one of three ways. And the first is said min wara hijab, which means behind a barrier. And the second is by sending an apostle, which that word apostle is used in English to translate Rasul, which means messenger, and is usually understood to refer to an angel. Yeah. And so we remember that, I mean, according to many accounts, it's the angel Gabriel who's the medium of revelation. And then the third is to provide inspiration. The Arabic word there is wahi. And so none of those are dreams. There are Quranic, rather Islamic hadith, so traditions surrounding the Prophet, which describe his experience of inspiration. And they're all meant to answer the question, how did the Prophet discern between his own thoughts and divine revelation? So in my reading of these traditions, these hadith are by nature apologetic. They're meant to sort of answer that problem, right? Because Muhammad's head is filled with thoughts. And yet the claim of Islam is that the Quran are not his thoughts, they're God's very words in Arabic. And so how was he able to? And, he speaks of having an experience like the ringing of a bell. He does speak of an experience where he would have some sort of intense mental state, which some people think means losing consciousness. And then he would remember the revelations afterwards. So, I mean, these are hadith, which I wouldn't see as historical. And I offhand, I don't remember any of them involving dreams in particular, but I could be wrong about that. There may be others I don't know.
Wow. Yeah, because one of the things I've wondered about is, it seems like dreams are actually a strong claim if you're doing apologetics to the Christian community at the time, but it's clearly not part of the subsequent lives of Muhammad. We start seeing even Christians in the next centuries referring to the revelations of Gabriel. And there's even some interesting points that the Christians are saying that the original story is that a vulture, which is a consonantal root of, I guess, NSR, Nasher, which can double, at least in the Semitic languages that I've looked at, also as an eagle. So I don't know if that's true in Arabic as well.
It is.
It is. I wonder if they picked vulture in Latin for particular reasons, that eagle is far more noble than a vulture. I have no idea. But I think the interesting thing is when it comes to his revelations, have you ever run across anything that would suggest that either Gabriel is represented by some sort of divine bird? I know this has been traced back to places like Arabic culture within the empire and some of the cities like Petra and their sacred birds and these sorts of things, but more in Islamic literature, if there's any sense that there could be something like this, as the dove in Christianity is symbolic of the Holy Spirit, so an eagle or a vulture is symbolic of the angel Gabriel. Interesting.
Yeah, well, most traditions speak of Gabriel appearing in the form of a man. And so there's a tradition I alluded to earlier that at the first revelation, as Muhammad was coming down from the mountain, he saw Gabriel on the horizon in the form of a man. There's a famous hadith of Gabriel in which the distinctions between belief, Islam, and good doing, so Iman, Islam, and Ihsan are revealed, in which Gabriel appears as a man. And then even in Surah 19, there's an allusion to God's Spirit appearing to Mary as a man. And that's understood to be Gabriel, usually in the scene of the Annunciation. So that's the standard, is that Gabriel appears as a man. I don't know of traditions associating him with a bird at all. Yeah.
Okay. Just to make sure that I'm not dominating the direction of looking at Muhammad's life, is there anything you wanted to make sure that we touched on before I kind of went to another topic? You're muted.
You can't hear you, William.
Sorry about that. I think you all are doing
Gotcha.
fantastic, and I'm learning a whole lot. One thing I did want to pick your brain on, both of you, Father Kappes and Dr. Reynolds. I'm curious about, because y'all touched upon Deuteronomy 18, and when it comes to Islam, I've done a little bit of work and looking in the way they look at it. Mainly modern day.
Why don't I read that out right now for you, William?
Yeah, could you do that?
This will be the Septuagint version. So, if ever among you there arise a prophet, and there's some emphasis in the Bahira legends of the prediction of arising a prophet, arise a prophet or a dreamer dream, and should give you a sign or a portent, and should the sign or the portent come true, which he spoke to you, saying, let us go and worship other gods whom you do not know. Do not listen to the words of this prophet or that dream or that dreamer, because the Lord your God tests you. So clearly this can be used against Muhammad if the early Muslims are claiming he had dreams.
Yeah.
So that's 1814. Go ahead.
Yeah, and that was what I wanted to kind of to pick. Perhaps you can touch upon it first, Dr. Reynolds, because when I look at Deuteronomy 18, and I've looked at the commentaries, I've looked at what Zakir Naik has to say about it, what Dr. Shakir Ali has to say about it, and I find their comments on it to be just so different than the earliest commentaries. If I look at the way this was interpreted by the very first followers of Christ, I can find it from the very earliest times where they identify the prophet like Moses to be Christ. You can find it as early as Clement of Alexandria, and probably earlier than that. I haven't done an incredibly deep dig there. To me, of course, as you all know very well, a Catholic or an Orthodox or even an evangelical will identify the prophet like Moses to have been Christ. I wonder what would be the reply if you point out that perhaps Damascene, part of his denial of Muhammad being a true prophet, as other individuals note, was that in the context of Deuteronomy 18, the brethren, the brothers that are mentioned there, are indicating that the prophet would come from the Jewish lineage. How is that dealt with within Islam. Is there a kind of a reply to that? What, just your thoughts?
I've seen a reply to that, William. It's okay, Father, if I jump in here.
Sure, please.
Yeah. So, I mean, as you say, the verse says, I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren, to give the King James there.
Sure.
And so, and the Hebrew is achehem. So they're literally their brothers, their brethren. I'm pretty sure it's in a medieval Islamic text where I've seen it. It could be Ali at-Tabari, but I'm not sure. Where the argument is, Ali at-Tabari is a 9th century scholar who wrote 2 books against Christianity. He was a convert from Christianity to Islam. So I think it's in this text, but it might be getting this wrong. The idea is that it's that term refers to a people who were brothers to the Israelite people. And so the Ishmaelites were the ones who were brothers to the Israelites. I'm not sure how coherent you found that argument, but that's how he does it. Yeah,
I get you. Okay, that's wonderful. Yeah, and as you know very well, for a Catholic or an Orthodox or an evangelical, you're right. It would be a little bit difficult for them to be able to find that to be charitable, to say coherent. But do you think that maybe, and I guess I'll toss the question to you, Father Kappes, do you think maybe that's perhaps part of the reason, among many others, as to why St. John Damascene would have had such strong language towards denying Muhammad as being a prophet? The fact that he recognized the identification of Christ as his prophet in Scripture, because he ticks all the boxes, and then the identification as well. We look in the earliest commentaries in the patristics, noting that as well. Do you think that could be part of the reason?
Yeah, I provide, and there may be a translation out there, but I don't remember finding one. But here's the translation of John Damascene's own words in regard to these passages that we're talking about. And this does have to do with the early life of Muhammad, because he is recognized as a prophet by Bahira in the Christian sources and in the Muslim sources by an overshadowing cloud. There's a lot of interesting things about overshadowing I might touch on in a second. But for now, let's listen to John Damascene. But when we ask, and who is there to testify that God gave him a book? And which of the prophets foretold that such, quote, a prophet would rise up, end quote? They are at a loss. So what we're hearing is John Damascene, and this seems to coincide, and obviously I always welcome corrections from Dr. Reynolds if I'm not up to date on the literature, but this seems to coincide with the literature that what has been extrapolated from what most people would recognize as the Dome of the Mosque and the
Dome of the Rock.
The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which are famous for these inscriptions. They can be found around there, and that none of them seem to draw on anything that enlightens us about Muhammad as such. And then there's no literature that enlightens us from this period about Muhammad. And so this seems to coincide with John's own claims that there is no current Muslim literature or oral tradition, because he's having dialogues in which they can provide for him a life of Muhammad, in which they can secure for John that he's like Jesus, or that he is like Moses. And so I suspect that this was being used in Christian Muslim dialogue, is it really beckons Muslims to either compile materials or to produce materials, ex nihilo, in order to affirm the status of Muhammad. And the last thing I'll kind of mention on this, and then let you, Doctor, or you, William, kind of weigh in on it. But I'm very fascinated by the use of overshadowing in Islam, particularly. I think is not the Caliph. I'm probably going to get the phraseology wrong, but isn't he the shadow of God, under the shadow of God, of Allah? As a title.
Yeah, I think that expression is used. Yes,
it is.
Yes, as far as I remember.
I'm very, very interested in overshadowing, because to me it shows that at least these early Islamic texts that in the life of Muhammad that are emphasizing it, I suspect that they're Christian converts because they're so well informed. But in the Old Testament, if we actually look at a systematic study of overshadowing, we see that it's always God's most intense form of divine presence. And it typically is centered on a quasi-divine being, whether it be false overshadowing with false gods, like a trinity of unsacred trees that is mentioned in one passage, or it be the mercy seat where God's presence is known between the overshadowing wings of the ark. Even in the New Testament, this is picked up by the overshadowing cloud over Jesus on Tabor, showing that he is the mercy seat of Yahweh's presence, flanked by two beings, not unlike the two cherubim. And we see that Mary's womb is explicitly overshadowed. The one thing that I find very interesting is that it doesn't seem to me that we have to deny that the Muslim, let's say, potential adoption of this tradition is distorting it, because I've always been fascinated with one exception to this rule, that it's not the divine presence itself, and that is Jonah. The prophet Jonah is overshadowed by, depending on your translation, a pumpkin plant or a gourd or something like this. But it is the same motif of having a divine miracle whereby he is overshadowed. And to the extent that Christ sees that as typological of himself, it's almost as if for a New Testament reader, Jonah is a quasi-divine in anticipation typologically of Jesus. For a Jewish reader, of course, this is probably more puzzling. Why you're emphasizing an overshadowing on Jonah when this is typically the activity of God in the most sacred and quasi-divine regions whereby he reveals himself. So I just would, in case you have seen some studies or you yourself have come across this, is this use of the metaphor of overshadowing, including with a caliph, which makes me wonder if the early caliphs, if this is a very old title, are in a certain sense successors of the Prophet Muhammad almost. They're almost legislating figures and not merely custodians. So those are my thoughts up to this point.
Wonderful. Yeah, great thoughts. And there's a lot to engage with there. Okay, William, if I respond to a couple of things.
Definitely. I'm really thrilled hearing how you're going to reply.
Okay. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, maybe I'll start with the last point, which is I don't know the beginning part, the point at which figures begin to refer to the caliph as the shadow of God. So I just don't know that point. However, in terms of the early caliphs, there's good reason to think that at least in the period of the so-called rightly guided caliphs, so from Abu Bakr, who dies in 634, to Ali, who dies in 661, and in the Umayyad period, maybe through Umar II, who's in the early 8th century, that there's a very high teaching on the status of the caliph.
Mm-hmm.
Just to give one sort of image or expression which reflects that, later caliphs spoke of themselves as Khalifat Rasulullah, which would mean the successor of the messenger of God. But some early caliphs seem to have thought of themselves as Khalifat Allah, which would mean like the representative or the vicegerent of God on earth. Remember too that in this early period, we do not have the full formation of either Sunni Islam or Shiite Islam. And another way of saying this is that the class of scholars who interpret religion for the people and establish religious norms to be enforced by the state, this class of scholars known as the ulama, haven't sort of been formed as a dominant force in society. I mean, this is taking place in the Abbasid period, principally. So we see this later on with figures like Ash-Shafi'i and Ahmad ibn Hanbal. But previous to this, the caliph seems to have had that political and religious authority in the early period. There's a wonderful book called God's Caliph by Patricia Crone and Martin Hines, which makes that argument, to my mind, very convincingly. Mm-hmm. I wanted to say a couple of things. I don't know if now is the right time, but just about the Prophet's biography generally, responding to some earlier points you made, and what we can know about Muhammad. Is he a figure that's sort of lost in the recesses of history, that was sort of reconstructed by the early Islamic biographies in an artificial way? Or do we have sort of a solid core of biographical material on Muhammad? It's a very difficult question to answer, actually. So a lot of it depends on your opinion of the Qur'an. I believe that the Qur'an is an early text, and that it is shaped in a way that revolves around the character of Muhammad. Now, the Qur'an, as you no doubt know, Father and William, gives us very scant biographical information of Muhammad. I mean, very little, as you probably know. It refers to the messenger as Muhammad on 4 occasions, as Ahmad on a 5th occasion. But the whole structuring of the text is oriented around the claim that a prophet has come. And most of the texts are divine messages to this prophet, who's then to pass them on to his followers. So, and I think the Quran is quite early, so I wouldn't doubt the historicity of Muhammad. I think that the early, and we could speak about this more, I know you've worked on this, the early Jewish and Christian sources speak to the existence of a prophet, someone who claimed to be a prophet, and give us some basic information beyond what the Quran says about the prophet. So there's the text, the Doctrine Jacobi, that early Greek Christian text, which people debate whether it's really from the 630s or not. Mm-hmm. But there are a number of texts. There's a text of Sabaeus, or maybe Pseudo-Sabaeus, who dies around 660, 661. If it's actually his, it's an Armenian text, which has a much more extensive mention of Muhammad. So, okay, but I would say generally that there should be a distinction between what we can know from the Quran and those early sources, and the later full-fledged, full flowering of the biographical material on Muhammad, with all of the stories of his childhood, his call to prophethood, his time in Mecca and his time in Medina. That's a really different thing. And so one can be much more discerning or critical about assessing those later traditions. I think a lot of them are actually exegetical, to use a fancy word. They're actually developing things that are in the Quran, answering questions provoked by the Quran. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of where I would stand when it comes to the historicity of Muhammad.
Thank you. I mean, I certainly don't have a lot of sympathy for... There are obviously very good Islamic studies scholars who may question, in some way or another, the historical Muhammad, much like the historical Jesus. But most of the approaches I've seen tend to, they don't seem to be inquisitive about the sources. They seem to just not want Muhammad to exist, quite honestly. And I certainly, from my perspective, looking at ancient Christian and non-Christian, but also non-Muslim texts, it seems to me that there's abundant evidence that Muhammad existed. If we only ask ourselves, do we have more historical evidence for the existence of Muhammad than Jesus? I think we might be able to say contemporaneous evidence that we do have more. And so I think that there is a lot of evidence there. Obviously, we can weigh each source, as you've mentioned, for how much weight we should put into it. But I definitely would agree with you that it's helpful for us to think of a historical Muhammad, and certainly John Damascene thinks of a Muhammad who composed the Qur'an. He doesn't seem to have any alternative polemic that this is some sort of text that is from a group or in any way derives from other than Muhammad. We have to remember that at this time Jerusalem is being heavily populated by Arabs. It eventually becomes, by the end of the century, when perhaps at the very time when Damascene is writing, the majority of the population. And so when he's dialoguing with these Arabs, he's got so many to choose from in these public debates, apparently, in the sense that they're probably happening in churches that are shared, that we would expect him to exploit as much negative material against Muhammad as possible.
Right.
And yet he chooses very, very succinctly to acknowledge that Muhammad is the author of the Quran. So I think there's something to that. It's obviously not one source proves everything, but it is an early one. Another interesting thing for me was I take it you've spent some time with the letter of Umar II. I don't know how popular that is in Islamic studies. I'm not really interested in all the little details. He does acknowledge the Bahira lesson that the young Muhammad is taught allegedly by Bahira or Nestor, but he rejects that, of course. But another thing that I found interesting, and this is maybe something for to help us understand the possible diversity of opinion in modern Islamic orthodoxy, is this letter of Umar II, which probably dates to about 750 AD, from what I understand. When there's a famous scandal that John Damascene also refers to, probably at least 50 years before this again. So sometime in the late 600s, I would estimate, at the Kathisma shrine known to him, that Muhammad divorced, as it's become known, his adopted son divorced his wife so that Muhammad could marry his formerly adopted son's wife. This was a scandal that was meant to embarrass the Muslims in the dialogues between John Damascene. When it's brought up in 750, it's apparently still an important piece of apologetic material against Islam. And there's actually quite a clever response by Umar II, and this is where I would really like your opinion on, Doctor, is the clever response by Umar II is, well, David was a sinner, and you guys obviously think he's pretty awesome. And look what he did to Uriah. So, I mean, when it comes to sinners, I mean, the implication is, I don't remember, I don't have a quote where Umar II is acknowledging that Muhammad is a sinner, but he is paralleling Muhammad in response to David. And I'm wondering, to my knowledge, there are oftentimes picked out around 2 passages in the Quran where it seems that the speaker, Muhammad, is acknowledging he is a sinner. Is there a tradition of accepting Muhammad as a sinner whose heart in his biography, is removed? It has to be cleansed by white snow, which is suspicious to me as something almost like more original sin. Is there a sinful Muhammad in the tradition that's allowed, or is the common orthodoxy now is that we don't have a sinful Muhammad as a young Muhammad that needed to be cleansed in his biography, and as a Muhammad who potentially made a mistake by forcing a marriage that really shouldn't have taken place?
Right, really, really interesting thoughts. So first on the letter of Omar II, this is so complicated, the story of this treatise, that I couldn't hope to describe it succinctly. That is part of a correspondence, as you no doubt know, that allegedly took place, but I think most scholars think probably never took place, between the Umayyad Caliph Omar II, who's remembered, Omar ibn Abdulaziz, remembered as sort of the very pious, the pious one among the Umayyads, most of whom were impious. And then the Byzantine Emperor Leo III, and the dates of their reigns sort of overlap. And so there's this construction of a treatise. And the really fascinating thing about this is that we have a whole series of documents from the Islamic side and a whole series of documents from the Christian side. And there seems to have been, in the construction of these documents, awareness of the other side, because there's actual responses to arguments that are really found there. But essentially, they were sort of transmitted independently. I don't know if that's super interesting to people. My colleague at Notre Dame, Tom Berman, is working on this with a team of scholars. There are Armenian traditions. There are this tradition got into Islamic Spain as well. So it's very, very complicated.
Are they getting close to dating an text?
They are, yes. They are coming out with an edition of all of the different strands of Omar Leo traditions and dating them separately. Yes.
At this particular point, can I put it in vague terms? Would you be optimistic that the text would date prior to Ibn Ishaq, or not necessarily?
I would not be optimistic.
Oh,
No,
okay.
no,
Thank you.
I think these are probably not. Yeah. So Ibn Ishaq, by tradition, dies in 767,
Mhm.
and from what I know from my colleague Professor Berman, these are later traditions projected back to the 720s, I think 720s, 730s, when Ahmed II and Leo would have been active. Hopefully, I'm getting those dates right. Yeah. So a couple of things about Muhammad and the question of sin. First of all. Really interesting question whether we can trust historically the story of Muhammad, his adopted son Zayd, and Zayd's wife Zainab. And you know, exactly as you said, Father Kappes, there's this story found within the biography, the Islamic biographies, that you know, the prophet goes to visit his adopted son. He sees his Zayd is not there, and he has a glimpse of Zainab and sort of falls in love with her. She's very beautiful, and it does remind us of the David story. So that's an interesting thing, David and Bathsheba, of course. And then he refuses to act on this, even though Zayd sort of implores him, no, you're the prophet of God, you have a better right. And then God confirms, I believe it's in Qur'an, sort of the Ahzab 33. Now, but when I say it's in the Qur'an, it's important to keep in mind a distinction between the story that we find in the biographies and the material connected to that story in the Qur'an. Because there are two possibilities. One is that the event really happened and the Qur'an is commenting on it. Or it's possible that the story about Muhammad and Zayd and Zainab was a way of explaining somewhat ambiguous material in Qur'an 33. I think it's the latter. I sort of hinted at this before, that a lot of the biography of the Prophet is exegetical. And, you know, some Muslims might not like that because, you know, they might want to have a robust opinion of what is authoritative in the tradition. But I mean, it's also in a way can be useful for dismantling traditional stories used to disparage Muhammad, like the satanic verses, like this story, because I think both of those are exegetical. They're produced by the Quran. We cannot rely on this as an accurate story. That's just my opinion of what actually happened between Muhammad and Zayd and Zainab. Having said that, you know, there probably, even if you distrust the story, as I do, it's still likely that something happened that Quran 33 is speaking about. I just don't think that the story as told in the biographies is actually memory, a document that records the events. I think it's produced by the Quran. So, I don't know if that's articulate at all, William. So you're probably thinking, gosh, his poor students have to deal with this back and forth and tangents. And then the final point, I mean, on the question of Muhammad's sinfulness. So we're speaking about the doctrine known as Esma. So Esma means something like being protected, or the protection from sin. The prophets are said to be masum, which is related to this word Esma. And so they're said to be protected from any sin. Okay, and there are different proof texts in the Quran that are sometimes cited to defend this doctrine that God is sort of has the back of the prophets and doesn't allow them to fall into sin. In fact, Islamic tradition has lots of different positions on this. William, is this interesting? Should I go on for a couple more minutes about this, or should I shut up and we move on?
No, it's fantastic. In fact, as you're doing that, I'm preparing a question to toss at both of you in just a moment. It's great.
Okay.
Continue.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, in fact, Islamic scholarship has lots of things to say about this idea of Isma. So, I mean, one question, for example, is, okay, a prophet cannot sin, but is that only after his call to prophethood? And part of this is the story that you allude to, Father Kappes, where we read in the childhood of Muhammad's life that two angels, this is in Ibn Ishaq, opened his breast, removed his heart, took out a black spot from the heart. That's probably also exegetical, connected to Quran chapter 94, which says, did we not expand your breast and take from it your burden? Or take from you your burden. So anyway, so if that does represent some sort of original sin, a Muslim could still say, well, that's before his call to prophethood. And that's used, for example, for the sin of Adam. It's sometimes said that, okay, he did sin clearly because he repents, but it was before he was a prophet. Or the Moses' killing of an Egyptian, which is alluded to clearly in the Qur'an, which it can be argued, okay, that was a sin, shouldn't have killed the Egyptian, bad idea, but it happened before he was called a prophet. So that's one possibility. And then another possibility, which is brought up by a school of theology known as the Hanbalis, is that, no, prophets actually can sin. In fact, in a sense, they must sin because only thereby can they manifest penitence. Only can they thereby manifest what's known in Islam as tawbah, so repentance. You have to sin first. And the prophets are not only virtuous in their conduct, but they're also virtuous in the way that they repent. And so most Hanbalis would say prophets are protected, ma'soom, in the communication of revelation, but not always in their behavior. So they actually can sin. And so now, in fact, as you might guess, Muhammad often is held up as a special case.
Sure.
So it is often said that, okay, like Moses sinned, Noah sinned. There's an interesting story about how Noah might have sinned. David definitely sinned. The Quran speaks of his repentance. I think it alludes to the Bathsheba story. But not Muhammad is often understood. He's often understood to be a special case, and especially in contemporary apologetics, as you both know. Like, I mean, Muslims today really, defend this as sort of as a place to mount a stand, and that Muhammad, other prophets might have sinned in small ways, but not Muhammad.
Great point there, Dr. Reynolds. I'd like to maybe get your thoughts on something. One thing that we hear it brought up very often among, whether it be Catholic or Orthodox or evangelicals, they'll note to a particular text in Damascene. And it's a very popular one that gets brought up very often, where Damascene, St. John Damascene, is pointing out, and he says that there is influence upon Muhammad from an Arian monk. But I think another piece of text that people tend to not focus on from Damascene is in another area. He doesn't only focus upon an Arian monk influence in Muhammad that he claims, but he says that, and I'm reading it, there were particular Jews, Christians, Arians, and Nestorians. Of course, it's talking about, kind of like a mishmash of heterodox views that influenced his theology. Now, I wonder, when it comes to these particular statements of St. John Damascene, would he have had any kind of early acquaintance to know these details? How would he have picked up this kind of information? And of course, I recognize that within the Islamic studies, they would probably, without a doubt, reject this from St. John Damascene. In terms of historical value, do his statements have any kind of historical value? Because I've heard people tell me, I say, well, you know what, that's polemical. He's claiming that Arianism influenced him. And then you look at the teachings of Arianism, and you might find some parallels there, but without a doubt, the Qur'an goes in a different direction in many different fields. But then it does open up even more, and it does make a lot more sense if you read St. John Damascene, not only arguing influence of Arianism, but arguing influence of Nestorianism and other areas. And when he does bring up the influence of Nestorianism, I am particularly, my ears perk up, because we know very well that the Quran doesn't portray Mary as Mother of God. That would have been something quite particular to Nestorius at that time in church history. So I wonder, do his statements have any kind of historical value? And perhaps maybe you can give your thoughts first, Father Kappes, and then Dr. Reynolds. I'd like you, or whoever wants to go first.
I'll let Dr. Reynolds decide.
Oh, I'll defer to you. Go for it,
Sure.
Bruno, please.
I thank you. It's nice. We're a Milkite seminary, so I do hear Abuno a lot.
Okay.
Yes. So I do put a footnote in the informal document that you have on your patristic pillars.com website.
Yeah.
And I think something that can be missed is that St. Athanasius himself tended to use the Arian brush to really be focused on the non-divinity claims of Jesus' status. So we have to be careful with John in a polemical context calling Bahira an Arian monk, because though he could be taken in the most literal sense, that we do have evidence of one of the so-called, I mean, there's arguments about how committed Constantine's so-called Arian sons were to Arianism versus just being the boss of everybody, right? So there were some foundations, including Yathrib, of a Christian church, which would have been under an Arian emperor. So it's not inconceivable that Arianism, in some sense or form, survived outside of the Roman Empire, as it did in many barbarian contexts. But I think with John Damascene, there's certainly the nuance there that he could be saying something like, a monk who did not acknowledge the divinity of Christ. From what we've seen with the kind of mixing and matching of various groups that were blending with one another, it's not always easy to place someone a sect. I mean, you go into a church or a mosque today and you ask their opinions on just about anything, boy, you're going to get some stories. And miracle stories and visions are probably everybody's favorite. And those probably tend to be the least wed to dogma that I've witnessed in literature. They tend to be rather exaggerated and hyperbolic. So I certainly am sympathetic to John Damascene's witness that he, in Muslim Christian debates where he has to dialogue with Muslims, he's not finding it unhelpful in dialogues with them to speak about, we'll call him Bahira, which probably just means a name of respect for a tested or a tried or approved religious, perhaps even given to priests. But so-called Bahira seems to be a point of agreement, at least amongst the dialoguers in the Jerusalem community who are from an Arabic background. That's what I would say.
Great. Should I jump in there, William?
Please.
Okay.
Thoughts on that? Thank you very much.
Yeah, wonderful. So, yeah, I would agree with everything Father Kappes said, and add to that, of course, that the text itself is that we have of John of Damascus is a compilation of the heresies, De Heresibus, and so it's sort of natural that he would engage with the beliefs of this proto-Islamic community around him in light of Christian heresies. So I think that context is pretty important. There's also a larger sort of a theme or motif of the Arabs as a people who were sort of helpless on their own, lost in the most decadent form of paganism, idolatry, and what changed had to have come from the outside. So even the notion that they understood themselves to be Ishmaelites or Hagarenes, I believe it's Josephus already, the Jewish historian, speaks of Jews reminding them of their Abrahamic roots through Ishmael. This is picked up by later Byzantine Christian historians like Sozomen and Theodoret, I think. So yeah, so that's sort of a notion. But then I would sort of challenge one aspect of that vision of sort of the Arabs as these pagan people who received heretical influences from the outside. And this is not really a response to anything Father Kappes said, because it's sort of a new or different point. But I think that the notion of Arabia as a land where heresies could spring up and be received, it's attractive. It's one of those arguments that is kind of attractive. because it just seems natural, like the Byzantine influence had a sort of limit, in the civilized lands, but then you go out into the desert and like anything goes, like you say wild things about God. And, I just don't see really solid evidence for not only Arians, but other imagined sects that could be behind the Quran. And then a final point is just to affirm something Father Kappes said, which I think is really important, which is, let's remember that how diverse Christian views and, as you say, Islamic views are about God in Christ. And so, I mean, today, just to use, a Latin Rite parish, if you go into my parish here in Indiana and you asked about, who is Jesus, like, boy, you'd get a lot of different answers. I mean, it's even if you were specific about like Christology, the divine and the human, how do these go together? What are the natures? You get lots of different answers.
You're doing pretty well as a Monophysite these days.
Yeah. So that's not the only heresy that's come back. I think we have Marcionites too, and others. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the same is basically true in late antiquity. So you don't need a sort of formal community of Arians or something else, some Judeo-Christians, Jewish Christians, to have survived somehow in Arabia to get many different Christological views within Christianity.
That is a really good point there. And without a doubt, you walk into various parishes, you're going to, unfortunately, probably get a number of erroneous views. Now, let me kind of pose this question for you, then, Dr. Reynolds. I look at it from a perspective of the field of work that I do, apologetics. But a Catholic apologist or even Orthodox would then offer a little bit of pushback, and then they would say, okay, well, yeah, we can grant that perhaps on the ground there are a number of people, and there are even groups of people that would have held rather unorthodox views on Christology. But then doesn't that, don't we run into problems then with the inspiration of the Quran, with the message that was put forth by Mohammed, when you realize that the Christology he was putting forth, the teachings in Christ, they tend to run contra to what was known as Orthodox Christology, what was passed on from what we would consider the Apostolic Church. How would a Muslim be able to deal with that? Because we can say, of course, you can run into all kinds of different views, but we realize that these views were deemed heretical, and these views were condemned by the time of Muhammad, multiple ecumenical councils already that dealt specifically with Christology. Isn't that, in my opinion, that from my perspective, you gentlemen know way more Islam than I do, but from my perspective as a Christian, I look at it and I say, okay, well, this is still problematic, because we've got the Apostolic Church gathering in council after council, even the Apostolic Fathers closest to the time of Christ, that are teaching these particular Christological points, and yet you find these teachings that come from Muhammad to be clearly at variance with that. I imagine you see the way I would look at it, right? How would from the Islamic perspective, how would you then answer that? How would that be tackled? Do you at least see that it seems to be a little bit problematic from our point of view? And whoever wants to tackle that.
No, please, Dr. Reynolds, since you're talking about how how Islamic minds in print and in conversation today would look at things.
Yeah, I can say a couple of things about that. I mean, first, maybe just to preface any comments, as I say with Muslim friends, historical critical research on the Quran, at least from my perspective, the way that I approach things, and with some dabbling in theology, much less than you, Father Kappes, but just because my colleagues around at Notre Dame are theologians, whereas my work is mostly historical. I mean, it just seems to me that the historical work can never really address the question of whether the Quran is revealed, Muhammad heard from God. Those are theological questions that are in a whole nother realm, right? So, but I mean, I would say from a historical perspective, yeah, there are signs in the Quran that the author was engaging with the religious world of late antiquity. And the way that the figure of Jesus is presented is intriguing. And, you know, I mean, one interesting point, for example, is the fact that he's still called Messiah or Messiah. So this is really interesting. It's probably maybe the most obvious point to make, but the Quran repeatedly calls him Messiah. It even has the Jews in Quran chapter 4, verse 157, refer to Jesus as El-Messiah and the prophet of God. As Messiah, and it doesn't seem to be concerned with what the meaning of Messiah might be. I mean, this is a major statement in the context of Jewish-Christian conversation to call Jesus Messiah. Also, the fact that Jesus is called Isa, that name is really interesting, and all sorts of debates over the origin of Isa. It's not what you'd expect from Semitic languages, where the first consonant instead is at the end. Yeshua in Christian Arabic is his name. So, I mean, I think there are signs of sort of the historical context that could be seen, and not only with the figure of Jesus, but with other elements of the Quran. And that's just normal. It's neither good nor bad. It's just normal. And these similar things are found with other texts. Now, why is it that the Quran sort of establishes a clear teaching against the divinity of Christ? I mean, it's a really big question, but you know, Quran, for example, chapter 9, verse 30 explicitly says the Messiah is not the Son of God. So that appears there. There seems to be Quran chapter 5, verse 17, chapter 5, verse 72, both seem to deny the divinity of Christ. So it's I'm not for a Christianizing reading of the Quran. I think the Quran denies the divinity of Christ. Why is that? Well, I think the answer probably has something to do with the Quran's own prophet and the authority of the prophet, which probably, but this is really speculative, so I wouldn't put this in print. You know, I just put it out there as just the beginning of ideas. Needed to establish himself independently from the Christian community, was rallying people around him in opposition to the Jews and Christians who were found in Arabia at the time. It's hard to know, you know, what the reasons were for that. I think is probably lost to us in history, why the movement didn't take place inside of, say, a Christian community as other reformers sought to do. I think it's probably connected to the figure of Abraham and the notion of the Arabs as the descendants of Abraham, and the notion that now revelation has been given to this people, that for many generations, the Arabs were hearing the revelation of God in a foreign language by foreign prophets or foreign missionaries. So they were hearing it in Greek or Syriac or other languages. And now is our turn. We have our own prophet. So I think all of that is somehow connected. But yeah, I would say there are lots of signs for the historical context in which the teaching on Christ is developed in the Quran.
I just would have a short point, William. Just thinking out loud, it seems to me that there's a double-edged sword in what I'm concentrating on. And that is that on one hand, I would suppose a very conciliatory sort of pro-dialogue Muslim could see admitting that Muhammad correctly got the Christians right with whom he was in dialogue, but that doesn't mean that he's interested in ecumenical councils. Whereas perhaps a more, we might say, traditionally minded Muslim who, like many Christians, would see things as overarching dogmas or what people believe that are officially promulgated, who cares what the individual, so to speak, holds, would be perfectly justified in saying that no, this represented Christianity, and whatever you guys are doing now, it doesn't really matter. That Muhammad got it right. So I'm not sure that the way that you pose the question in and of itself demands one standard answer, but I don't think that I have the ability to come up with an apologetic on behalf of another community in order to give that answer. But I know that you have to think in those terms because you enthusiastically, as well as your Muslim interlocutors enthusiastically, want to talk in these terms. So it's a valid question, but I'm not sure that the Quran taken by itself, which of course, I mean, there are Quranis out there, I guess, but I mean, pretty much everybody else reads it through a tradition, and I guess they would feel very wed to the tradition to answer that question for you, which is probably a lot of confidence in the tafsir and a lot of confidence in certain hadith that are going to double down on this is really what Christians are about at the time that Muhammad is speaking. And I just like Dr. Reynolds to make sure that I didn't overstate my my claim there, since I don't know the tafsir or the hadith extensively as he does.
I think that's right. And if I could just add something more about a Muslim perspective on Jesus, there is a trend in contemporary Muslim scholarship. It appears in the very interesting book by Mustafa Ekyol called The Islamic Jesus, I think. But I've seen it online quite a bit too, which does something new in defending the Islamic position on Jesus, which is to look at biblical scholarship and to find strains of biblical scholarship which have a low Christology or emphasize the primitive teaching of the church as holding a low Christology. You've probably heard that view before. So like one popular idea is that Q, the supposed, not the Qur'an, but the supposed source of, along with of Mark, of Matthew and Luke, represents the primitive teaching of Jesus and had a low Christology. I've heard, I think this is maybe less impressive, but I've heard the idea that with the Quran, when it speaks about a gospel, it's referring to the diatessaron, so the harmony of the four gospels, and that the diatessaron had a low Christology. I actually, Father Kappes would probably know better. I don't know if it actually has a low Christology. So I think there are creative ways. And then, of course, an older one that began with Rashid Ridda, I think at the beginning of the 20th century, is that, the Gospel of Barnabas is gives testimony to a low Christology that existed in the early church. So by these readings, and of course, Gospel of Barnabas is a medieval text, and sophisticated Muslims recognize that. But using these texts, there's a way of saying that, listen, basically, Muhammad got it right about Jesus. He was recapturing the true Semitic prophet Jesus and shedding away the Roman or Greek convoluted and heretical ideas about Christ's divinity and the Trinity.
Those are great points there, Dr. Reynolds. And yeah, you're definitely correct when it comes to the Gospel of Barnabas. So people that might not know, that is rather late. When we talk about the Epistle of Barnabas, that one is an apostolic patristic text, and it would not have low Christologies. That's a really good. I'm glad you made that point, because erudite, astute Islamic scholars have no problem recognizing that. I think sometimes people nowadays don't realize that they're two very different documents, but that's a very, very good point there. Before we wrap up, I'd like to give both of you time, I guess to give any kind of like final comments, any kind of final statements, and really just plug anything you all have been working on, anything you all want to direct the audience to. Just really appreciated your time. It's been an incredible discussion. And I know the audience are going to be very, very edified. I'd like to give you all time to put in any plug and anything you'd like to. Whoever would like to go first.
Well, I'd like Dr. Reynolds to have the last word. So I'll just very briefly say, It's been very enjoyable to be with you live, Dr. Reynolds. As you know from my opening comments, had a chance to engage not only those texts, but also your commentaries on the Quran, which I find super helpful, even though it's obviously your colleagues are working with you. Very helpful for me to understand better how to engage the tradition of Islam when I'm looking at it more patristically oriented. Secondly, as far as how much we've been able to accomplish today, in a little bit over an hour, we've kind of got through some major points in the young life of Muhammad, and of course, I didn't expect us to get through his entire life, which is quite lengthy. But I think it's really great for me to hear different ways of engaging with that early material, because I've not seen anyone that's really done it before whose specialty is on the broad range of materials that speak of Muhammad, principally from an Islamic perspective. As far as anything that I'm working on, I would just re-recommend, especially the works that we already have out, particularly our discussion of Mary. Certainly a project in the future that I'd really love to do, because I know Shabir Ali took interest in our book on Mary, would be maybe something talking about the appropriate and very laudatory theological strains of Mariology that I feel like I can detect within the Quran itself. So I think there's a lot of great traditions and potential reflection of Christian material, which of course from a Muslim perspective would just be Christians actually didn't corrupt or get wrong, or I guess mishandle that material, and so that's the reason why it's the same. But nonetheless, I think there's a lot of great parallels that we can share the similar values with one another on Mary's life and vocation.
Well, that's a very beautiful note to end on. So I feel bad adding anything more because, yeah, it's really important to emphasize that. And with my students at Notre Dame, I often tell them, listen, most of whom are Catholics, some not really serious about their faith, but I tell them, listen, the study of Islam is a great opportunity to be edified by Muslims. Muslims can encourage you to have reverence for God, to take your own ethical demands of your own tradition and the practices of your own tradition seriously as they do, so they can be exemplary for Christians. And anyway, just to add with self-promotion, which I'm never shy about. So,
oh, good.
Yeah, I just mentioned two things. One is, my most recent book is 2020. It's called Allah, God, and the Qur'an. So it can be found anywhere, including that giant book site and everything else site. So that might be interesting. That's an exploration of what the Quran says about God, and ask questions like, will unbelievers from the Quran's perspective be saved? And do humans have the right to take out vengeance on others, or is that God's job? God's job. And then, as William graciously mentioned at the beginning, I'd encourage everyone to take a visit also to my YouTube channel, which is called Exploring the Quran and the Bible, which is lots of conversations with leading scholars, Muslim and non-Muslim, about the Quran and about the Bible.
And there will be a link down there for people to be able to find that by the time that they're looking at the show. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I've had an incredible, edifying time dialoguing with both of you all, and I look forward to talking to you all both, perhaps together in the future again. This was very edifying. Thank you very much, and God bless you, Father Kappes, and God bless you, Dr. Reynolds. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much.